But this is gonna be recorded, so everything, since we're recorded, it's gonna record. We can just put it on YouTube, and then we'll see how many views and things like that, and go from there. So all of this knowledge and all of this advice and everything we do today will
But
be
this is gonna be
given
recorded, so
for.
everything, since we're
I
recorded,
think.
it's gonna
I
record.
think
We
there's
can
a
just put it on
there's a
YouTube, and then we'll see.
Apologies. I'm just trying to figure out the YouTube, how to connect to YouTube. All right, I think we're live. If you guys, if anyone wants to just jump onto the YouTube link, it should be in the corner to your right on the bottom of your screen. Willie, do you want to just make sure that it's running on there?
So it is on.
Yeah, I just checked and it's live.
All right, amazing. We're streaming. Perfect.
The YouTube sort of lag though.
Yeah, it's gonna have lag. It's just gonna be a little bit laggy, but that's fine. It's gonna have a delay. Cool. All right, Bismillah. Welcome to Paradigm Podcast, where we discuss all things academia, ranging from medicine, engineering, all the way to business and more. Our goal in this podcast is to sit down with Muslim leaders, innovators, and jump into their paradigm, their reality, to better understand their story and shift and see the way they see the world. So, in impact and solving problems in our world, right? So that brings me to a remarkable example of problem solving and impact, Dr. Muhammad Zaman. I just want to give a brief intro. Out of all the accolades and all of the titles, I had to cut down and kind of make this shorter. But Professor Muhammad Zaman is a professor of biomedical engineering and international health at BU. Dr. Zaman received his PhD from the University of Chicago in physical chemistry and is the first Pakistani to receive the Howard Hughes professorship. His work ranges from working at MIT in the Department of Bioengineering for cancer research to the front lines of public health and refugee relief organizations in Syria and Lebanon. He is the co-director of UN Africa Biomedical Initiative, as well as the director of Global Health Technologies. Please welcome Dr. Muhammad Zaman.
Thank you so much. Well, I mean, please go ahead with the question that you may have,
Perfect.
Talha. I'm honored to be here. I'm seeing many familiar faces here, certainly your family, people who are in my lab, people who I've had the chance to work with. So it's really an honor to be here.
All right. So, I mean, what we're going to try to do in this podcast is basically an hour of me and you going back and forth, just discussing your story and your journey as a Pakistani Muslim, growing up and figuring out basically what you wanted your career to be and what your impact, your legacy or impacts you want to leave. Right. So that's basically that first hour. And then after that, we'll delve into just Q&A and any questions that anyone wants to ask you. And Noura will help us with that, as anyone can write in the chat questions and then ask those. So one of the first questions that I had to cut down a lot of my questions. I had a lot of questions and I had a few other questions that other people gave me. So we're just gonna go into the first one. So what is like the biggest field that you were curious about while you were growing up? And why did you end up choosing BME?
So that's a great question. So I grew up in a family of academics. My father was a university professor. My mother was a teacher. My elder brother, who I have learned a lot from and deeply admire, is also a professor. So I grew up in a family of academics. And so I was surrounded by books and academic conversations. From a early age, I would say middle school, somewhere in that time, if I remember, I wanted to become a scientist. I wanted to sort of do things in the lab. So I pursued that, and I was very fortunate to grow up in a family where everybody, I mean, my brother, my sisters, myself, were sort of told, not only given the opportunity, but sort of encouraged to really pursue what we were interested in. So the quintessential, I would say, stereotype that you often hear about, sort of parents really holding a heavy hand in terms of whether their kids should become doctors or engineers or this or that. That wasn't the case in my family at all. My father died when I was quite young. I was not even 11. And so my mother and my sisters played a very important role in how I started to see the world. My elder brother that I mentioned was an inspiration, but I was quite young when he went abroad for his PhD. So part of my growing up was surrounded by three women in a society that has been and continues to be male dominated and is fairly chauvinist. So I saw things from that lens. I went abroad for my undergrad and PhD and other things. And I think my interest in chemistry molded into interest in health and public health.
A quick question. So do you think like growing up with three women, do you think they kind of shaped the way you saw the world, and did that change like the way you saw the world?
Absolutely, very much so. So I saw my mother and my two sisters, and I saw things. You know, when you're growing up with something, sometimes it's very hard to really recognize the injustice, and it's much later in life that you see that this is not how it should be. It was my mother was a remarkable woman, and she was one that really sort of gave. I never felt that we didn't lack anything. I mean, we were strictly middle class, certainly from an educated family, but she worked very hard. She gave us a sense of confidence. She gave a sense of independence. So yeah, tremendously. For example, and this is a question perhaps you should ask my wife, how she thinks about this. But I felt strongly about associating myself with what we would call in the modern world feminist ideals of sort of equality, of sort of recognizing that there is something deeply wrong in a male-dominated society. Now, unfortunately, in a society like Pakistan, and I know some people here may be familiar with that, male dominance is often cloaked in the guise of religion, right? You assume that this is how religion is, and that's absolutely not true. And that's how it was in Pakistan. So it took me quite some time to associate and recognize that definition of religion, of male domination, of certain culture was actually largely cultural and not religious at all. And I saw it firsthand, given my mother, and they were all what we would call normal, decent religious people, and so that shaped my worldview tremendously. It took me quite some time, Talha, to reconcile many of these things in my own life. So I worked, I went to grad school and then postdoc and then faculty position. I was interested in issues in chemistry. And I'll come to this biomedical engineering part in a second. And I realized that there was something in me that wanted to do more for the society that I came from. And here, what I mean is not society in Pakistan, but what I would call low middle income countries, in places where things are tough. Now, how did a chemist end up in a biomedical engineering department? Remember, biomedical engineering is a very relatively new discipline. So many people who actually work in biomedical engineering are not trained as biomedical engineers. They rather use many of the engineering tools to solve important problems in health. So that's what the umbrella of biomedical engineering is. Mm-hmm. The notion, most of the people who are my colleagues in my age come from a time when biomedical engineering wasn't even a degree. Many of the people now who are coming to our faculty, who would be 10, 15 years younger than I was when I started my career, were that. Would come from biomedical engineering. So it's more about quantitative approaches to solve problems in medicine or in health. And that sort of became, the biomedical engineering discipline became an attractor for those kinds of things. It's changing now. So that's how I ended up. So I finished my PhD, and then I ended up doing a postdoc at MIT in bioengineering. And often what happens in faculty positions is that you end up in the department in which you did postdoc, as opposed to ending up in the department in which you were a graduate student. So that's the story. So I was at University of Texas in Austin for about 3 years. And then I was recruited by Boston University. So I came to BU in 2009. Around that time, I had realized that I wanted to spend more of my time looking at problems in society, not just in the lab. So my career took a major sort of, I would say I added that part, and now it's most of that part is focused on what I would call global health or public health. At the same time, I started to recognize that the challenges, and I started traveling quite a bit. So I started working in Africa. And I realized that many of the challenges cannot be solved by engineering or medicine alone. So we need to work with humanists and social scientists and anthropologists to really understand these challenges, economists, people in divinity schools. People are complex, problems are complex, and taking sort of, I would say, a monochromatic approach or a singular lens is actually quite problematic, and in some ways is that. And so reflecting back, I think it was part of my training. My brother, I mentioned, who was a eminent historian, and my own family. So there was always part of me that had a deeper appreciation for social sciences. So for me, that transition to incorporate many of those things were relatively easier because I grew up in that environment. Anyway, so that's the story of what I was fascinated by and how I've sort of decided to spend part or perhaps significant part of my time on looking at questions and problems that I think are important in society. And that's my perspective. Somebody else might completely disagree and say, no, these problems are not the ones that are important. These other ones are, and that's perfectly fine as well.
So I heard you touch upon a little bit about Islam, and so I was wondering what parts of Islam, or does your identity as a Muslim drive you in any way in your career, in your impact?
So I think that's a great question. And when you sent me a couple of sort of thinking points last night, I was thinking about it. For me, it's actually very hard to separate that. I do not see that there's a point in my time at any point where I would say I am more of a Muslim or Islam is more of an identity right now than it is at this point. I think it's interwoven in how I think, in how I reflect, and in many ways in how I question things as well that are taken for granted in a certain worldview of Islam that we believe in. And I think I find some of the practices more cultural, and I do find many of those things questionable. And again, I spoke about sort of looking at the things from the worldview of women and sort of having a particular caricature of what women can and cannot do, what women should and shouldn't do. I think I look around and I often wonder and think about what is Islam and what is culture. And so that's one thing that I often think about. I think for me, Islam and being a Muslim is more, and again, this is very personal. Certainly I have no capacity, training, or interest being a preacher of any sort of standing. For me, it's more trying to find a spiritual compass of sorts that is that allows me to have a purpose. For me, it's the element of the working for people and trying to do something to ease the suffering. And people here is by no means Muslims alone, not at all, by any stretch of imagination. So for me, it's that sense of identity of who I am and how I think about these questions as a Muslim and somebody who is on a path or a personal search, I guess, to find meaning. And that goes to your question of your legacy. I think that would be my goal, that when I leave this world, I look back and say that I was able to make a difference in somebody's life. And I think that's what I would like. People who I know, and many people I hope who I've never had a chance to meet. So I think that's how I would like to look at it.
Yeah. So saying, going off of kind of like that legacy piece, I'd say like working with like those organizations, right? Refugee organizations. Could you talk a little bit about those refugee organizations and any moments, specific moments that you had that stood out?
So there's several. When I was growing up in Pakistan, this is mid to late 1980s. Our home was in Islamabad, in a nice part of the city, and there were Afghan refugees all around us, everywhere. And I grew up in a world where it was perfectly normal to be racist and xenophobic, a place where you would blame all problems on the foreigner, on the Afghan refugee. Narcotics, terrorism, child kidnapping, and people would not take ownership of. And I grew up in that world, and I thought that was normal. And I thought that's how it is, that these people are really ungrateful for the hospitality Pakistan is providing them. And instead, they're creating all kinds of chaos, right? So you have to remember that this is the world that I grew up in. It's much later in my life when I realized that that was awful and that was just wrong. And how, and part of it perhaps was being Muslim in America, being immigrant, being the outsider. Could be other reasons, I don't know. But it was much later in life when I started to question that everybody around me was just, for lack of a better term, being extremely xenophobic. So that was one point in my mind that I found very troubling. It was much later, I would say about 10 years ago, or perhaps a little bit before, when I started to really think about the meaning of my own life and what I wanted to do for various people. But the turning point, the real turning point actually, came about 6 years ago. So I was invited to a conference at American University of Beirut. This is about 2016, so 5 years ago actually. And the title of the conference was the role of the university in, I still remember it very clearly, the role of the university in post-conflict rebuilding. And then I asked myself at that conference, while I was in Beirut, that what is the role of an individual in post-conflict rebuilding? What should a person do? Whether that person is an academic or a poet or a construction worker or anything. And I started thinking deeply about what conflict does, who are the people who are affected by that conflict, and the marginalized, the vulnerable. Out of that came out of several programs. I know there are people here who've traveled with us in some of those programs as well. And Rana here has done some phenomenal work in our partnership with Yemen as well. Just absolutely fascinating work. So that sort of those two things, and this has happened throughout my life, is that there are threads that I find that were, I would say, loose ends at some point in my life, and they sort of connect at a different stage in my life. I guess that's what growing older, having some kind of a midlife crisis is all about. But that's what happened. So then I said, in the next 10 years, so this is 2015 or 16, I want to learn, think, read, and work towards these issues of refugee well-being. And out of refugee is a I would say term here which is perhaps slightly inaccurate, because some of our work is for people who are technically not refugees. For example, people in Yemen, the work that I mentioned that Rana is spearheading and sort of really leading and doing amazing work. That is for IDPs, people who are technically not refugees, or some of my work in Pakistan with Bengalis who the state basically has made stateless. They are not refugees. They've always lived in that place. They've just become stateless because largely of xenophobia and racism. So they're not technically refugees. So it's broadly that has given a lot of meaning to my life. Salha, I'm working on a book on that issue, on access to healthcare among refugees. And I find that work to be tremendously gratifying and meaningful about who I am, what I want to do in life. You asked me about the organizations. I have respect for people who work in those organizations. I am not sure I have a lot of respect for refugee well-being organizations as a whole. I think there's a lot of bureaucracy there. I think there's a lot of elements of colonialism there. The people that we have worked with are just phenomenal. They are brilliant. They are kind. They are driven by great intentions, but there are institutional problems that I think are there. So I'm not sure I would say that I am a big fan of UN agencies. I think there's a lot good that is happening, but I think there's a need for reform as well. And and the more I research and the more I work with these things, I mentioned some work on a book that I'm working on or working with the communities there, you find that there are structural problems there. And that's part of the reason that things don't change for some of the vulnerable people who have no political, financial, or social agency.
And I mean, my father, he himself kind of, he started his own kind of organization building wells in Pakistan due to the lack of clean water there. And so one of the things he saw, like he tried to build wells through organizations. And what he saw is that if you'd give, say, like $200, maybe like only 20% would reach the actual like place where people need help, right? So instead of building electric wells, we like say, I think we paid, I don't know what organization was it, but it was an organization that was well known. And so like he gave maybe 200 and then only 20% reached the people there. And so he went out of his way and tried to make electric wells there, things like that. So is that part of the problem? Do you think it's because like the money is being put in different places?
I think that's one part of the problem, Talha. There are many other problems there. There is, of course, this element of, so there are a number of people who have done phenomenal work in thinking about what is a refugee camp actually for and who is it actually helping? And the answer is, it's actually not really helping the refugees. In some ways, it is a means to keep the refugees away from the rest of the population. It is, in fact, creating barriers between us and them, and there is a very clear them there. There's also a sense that for many states, and again, I don't want to name names here, their investment in refugee camps. So let's say country X hosts, I don't know, 1 million refugees or something like that. For them, it's a way to get money from international agencies and becomes a business in some sorts, and that's problematic. Then there is this notion of international agencies that, as you mentioned, there's a huge sort of a cost of overhead costs. But many of them actually are not really interested in getting to know the people on the ground. They don't treat them with the dignity that these people deserve. They don't respect them as fellow human beings. And especially when it comes to health, there is an element of, instead of empathy, there's often pity and a lack of recognition that these people are just people just like you and me. And you know, an engineering course wouldn't teach you that. You have to spend time with these people and work across the disciplinary boundaries to understand some of these issues. And then there's the global elements of politics as well. It should not be okay for somebody in Shatila, which is in the middle of Beirut, a young girl of 4 or 5 years old, to be a 4th generation refugee with having no citizenship whatsoever. Right? It wasn't even her grandparents that were forced to flee. It was her great grandparents. And so the fact is that they are not Lebanese citizens. They are not any citizens. Should really trouble us. That can happen to anyone. Same thing in Pakistan, the Bengalis and elsewhere as well. And even in countries where we don't like to acknowledge there are refugees. So for example, people often don't acknowledge that there are Sudanese or Syrian refugees in Egypt, or the fact that while Yemen has had its own set of very, very difficult challenges, the perpetrators are neighboring countries. So there are very tough questions that one has to ask here. So while I agree with you that not getting money all the way to the final point is one issue, but I think there are deeper structural issues as well that we have to understand as well.
So I know you now are working as a professor in your classroom setting. Do you plan on going into these areas in the future I know you've traveled a lot, so do you plan on going to these places in the future now too?
Yeah, we have, and we do. So along with a colleague of mine in English and Gender Studies, Professor Carrie Preston, I've created, or rather co-founded, the Initiative on Forced Displacement on campus, and I'll be happy to share some information about that. And the idea is to develop ethical understanding of some of these challenges and coming up with, I don't want to call it solutions, but approaches to address this. I don't want to be presumptuous here and say that we are offering solutions. Perhaps we are not, but perhaps we are thinking of ways. So we have 3 places where we have done work and continue to do so. Lebanon is one, Colombia is another, Uganda is a third. In addition to that, there are other research projects in my group where we are looking at. So I mentioned Rana has been leading this effort with colleagues in Yemen. There's some work that I'm doing in Pakistan as well. So hopefully, inshallah, as things get better, I do plan to travel and work with the community. It's very important to spend time there and not just let a newspaper story, no matter how well done it may be, tell you the story. I was in a class this morning, I was telling students about the fact that in one of the trips that when we went to a refugee camp at the sort of border of Syria and Lebanon, we were in a sort of a tent, and people are incredibly generous and hospitable despite having very limited resources. And there was a mother who just wanted to talk to me about her tomato garden, right? So she found out that my wife likes to garden, and we're talking about it. My Arabic is terrible, barely any quality. But the ability to have a normal conversation is important, is to recognize that bond of humanity. I've never been to a place where you would kick a soccer ball at a little kid and the kid wouldn't kick it back. Sort of just trying to understand people as humans. I think that's important, and that's where I drive my inspiration from for some of this work, and thinking about certainly books and articles and stories and all of that is good. But being on the ground is, I think, absolutely critical.
So is that part of your, like, is that you'd say that's like your favorite part, kind of traveling and going to understand people? What's your favorite part of your job?
I think there are many favorite parts. I think all of them are important. So I think I like to think and spend time, I would say, looking at the material that we may have collected or other people may have done. So reading about it, I like to read quite a bit. I like to be in something that engineering professors typically don't do. I like to be in archives and read stuff from some time ago, trying to make sense of the historical evolution of many of these things. And I absolutely love to travel and meet people. So I think all of them have an importance, because if you're only on the ground but don't take the time to synthesize and distill it, then I think you'll lose something there as well. I think it's important to take a step back and reflect on this, and not so there's value in people who roll up their sleeves and get things done on the ground. You mentioned your father who is interested in bringing clean water, and that's, I think, important. I don't think I have skills for that. I think my ability is more on the analysis side, on the reflection side, on the writing side. And I think for me, it's important that I take a step back and reflect on this and don't get caught up in the issues of day to day, which absolutely important, but perhaps somebody else who has the ability to navigate the system better can do it better than I can. My, I think, role can be in shedding light on the challenges and thinking perhaps at a slightly more at a different level to analyze these things.
Yeah. So you saying like you being able to plan it and then having someone else execute in that sense.
Yeah, I would say planning is one, but even analysis, right? So an understanding of that. So that includes data analysis, that includes collection of data, that includes thinking about it. Policy is one part of this, analysis is another, reflecting on it is another, writing about it. So I think things that I can do from a distance as well as can routinely work on the ground is what I find I think meaningful.
So why did you want to become a professor then?
So as I mentioned, I don't know. I can't answer why. This is what I grew up with. So in some ways, for me, this was a path that I'd seen. So as I mentioned, my mother was a teacher. My sister is also a professor in Pakistan. My brother, who was has been absolutely instrumental in shaping sort of my intellectual curiosity in many ways. So I saw these people, and to me that was a path that I wanted to take. So for me, it was never a question of debating 4 or 5 different careers. It was something that I wanted to be with. I love books. I wanted to be around books. I love to think, and it's not to say that there are no other jobs that don't allow you to do that. I never pursued those, partly because I never thought that I wanted to. I could have had a completely different parallel life if I had taken a few different decisions at key points in my life, and I chose this, and I'm alhamdulillah very glad that I did. I'm very happy.
Yeah. Has COVID changed a lot of the things you've tried to do with your lab and your work?
In some ways, yes. So I have to sort of preface this question with what I'm going to say. Let me just answer that. I recognize the tremendous pain and hardship that COVID has caused, and the challenge for some of the communities where we work, particularly Yemen, and Rana knows this very, very well, has been just awful. It's been really hard. That said, I personally have not had any problems, alhamdulillah, none. I've been well. We've had a roof over our head, plenty to eat. My kids are healthy. My wife, everybody's healthy. So I've been very fortunate in that sense. And yeah. So that's the first part of your question. In terms of lab, I've been again blessed with people who are both resilient and dedicated. So when COVID hit, a significant part of my lab did not require to be trained, and we have enough space in the lab that people could still work without having to really be affected by that. So the lab work has continued as well. Personally, I spend a lot more time at home, which I'm very fortunate and very blessed about it. I mean, we have a home where we have power and water and plenty to eat. It gave me a lot of time to read and to think and to write. Some of the time that I spent in commuting, I was able to sort of, I think, recover that. I think I learned new things about my own neighborhood, and being able to sort of perhaps take a walk or go out jogging. So while it has been a difficult journey, I consider myself very fortunate that I cannot think of anything that I would call negative effects, other than the fact that I don't get to meet as many people in person. But that has been okay.
Yeah. So you mentioned your writing. I wanted to just ask you a few questions about. Could you give us like a little bit, like an analysis of your latest book, so Biography of Resistance, and how that relates to COVID?
So the answer is it doesn't relate directly to COVID. And I hope it doesn't relate to COVID in the short or the long term, but it could. So the great 1918 pandemic, sort of popularly known as Spanish flu, was a viral infection. But it turns out that a significant number of people who died, a fairly high number as a matter of fact, died of bacterial pneumonia. Now, there is a real risk. And part of the reason that happened was because we didn't have any antibiotics at that time. However, now we do have antibiotics, but we do have alarming rates of antibiotic resistance. So we have to be vigilant that what is called a secondary infection or a co-infection from bacteria can develop and can affect a lot of people. So the book is about how did antibiotic resistance develop? What is the story of that? What is the history of that? And reflecting on this, Talha, thinking about it as what went wrong and how did we end up in the world right now where antibiotic resistance continues to be a major challenge all over the world, whether you are in a hospital in Boston or in any other country. And to me, that has been an interesting story, thinking about how we ended up here and reflecting on perhaps what is going to get us out of this is, again, the very things that got us here. And that includes sort of, I think, overuse of antibiotics because of hubris, poor understanding of our relationship with the environment, excessive greed in some ways in the pharma and the farming industry, both. Use of antibiotics in animals. So in many ways, there are similarities with COVID, zoonotic diseases jumping from animals to humans, I think the world as we saw and continue to see in some ways, a nationalist agenda, me first. I mean, we are living in that in some ways in COVID. And towards the end of February, on the 20th or so, there was a report saying that 135 countries didn't even have a single vaccine. So again, those kinds of things continue to be a challenge that were an issue early on in antibiotic resistance and are similar in COVID as well. But that's the story of looking at another disaster, potential disaster, and thinking about how did we end up here and what can we do to change it? So the reason I wrote it is, I started working on it 3 or 4 years ago, was I had felt, one, as I mentioned, I enjoy writing and reading, but I also felt that there's a greater need for scientists and engineers and doctors to be in the public debate domain. I wanted to write a book that my kids could read, the teachers could read, somebody in my mosque could read, my neighbor could read, my uncle or aunt could read. And it needs to be accessible, yet technically accurate, right? So I wanted to sort of fill that gap that exists. So either things are too dense or things are sometimes sort of watered down to the point that they become silly. So I wanted to sort of reach that medium of being able to do that, but at the same time recognizing, as I mentioned earlier, that scientists have a tremendous role to play here, yet that role needs to be driven by a sense of humility that they have one seat at this long table. Environmentalists and lawyers and politicians and farmers and doctors, all of us have to do it together. And I think that is something that I felt that needs to be emphasized.
So what is the most exciting thing that you about future research that you'd want to talk about?
Yeah, so I think there's several. So I think have become broadly interested in this issue of access to healthcare among vulnerable and marginalized communities. And some of that work is not just in Lebanon and Pakistan, but also among Native American tribes in South Dakota. So we have a new project on that as well. So I'm interested in this question that people and groups of people, communities who are historically marginalized through colonialism, through violence, through political oppression, how do they navigate healthcare, and what can we do to improve that access? So that's the broader question. Within that, there are questions of, for example, access that is affected by conflict. So the work in Yemen that Rana is part of is focused on that. It could be driven by states' own xenophobia. So the work in Pakistan is part of that. It could be because of the burden of colonialism that is something that we would see in South Dakota or parts of Africa. I work closely with a high school in New York City, in Bronx, and I was talking, and brilliant. It's a very diverse community, and brilliant young boys and girls, and we were talking about various things, and a girl came up to me, of course, in Zoom, and said that, how do you know that the current vaccination campaign is not another Tuskegee? The famous trials that went for 40 years on syphilis studies with the sharecroppers, African-American sharecroppers, which was basically torture. And the answer to that is no, you are being anti-vaxxer. The answer is that I hope not, but that burden of trust that has eroded is very real, right? So if you see around yourself and you see sort of aspects of trust between marginalized communities, whether it is the Muslims in New York or African Americans or Hispanic communities or refugees or Native American communities, there is a very real issue of lack of trust. And my hope is that I want to understand the barriers to accessing health, and doing something to improve it. Some of it may require developing new technologies. Some of it may require new algorithms and new tools of analysis. And some of it may require working with community partners. So that's what I think is important in my own research. I do not want to say this is important in my field, because I can only give sort of my own sense, and I am not one who's going to sort of comment on what's hot and what's not, because it's very relative. I'm interested in the question of antibiotic resistance, because there is a disproportionate impact of antibiotic resistance on communities that are low income, that are in refugee camps, that are living by urban slums. That's a problem that I'm interested in. I'm interested in the question of interaction of antibiotic resistance with nutrition, with access to healthcare. One of the projects that we're interested in right now is, for example, one of the things that people are talking a lot about is microbiome. But for example, what happens in the microbiome of communities in Gaza, right? So Gaza is probably one of the most difficult camps in the world, sort of an open air refugee camp of sorts. You have urban sanitation issues. You have quite serious poverty. You have tremendous stress among people, among women. You also have a fear of conflict that can spark at any moment. And you have dietary and nutrition challenges. And the question is, can we understand some of the microbiome stuff there to be able to improve the current policies that are there within that community in terms of nutrition of mothers and babies? And that would require science and lab work, but it would also require understanding behavior and policy and how people live their lives.
So does that plays a part in trust, right? So trusting like the people that are distributing all the medicine, all the vaccines. So if they don't trust people, then you already have a problem. And then you also have the problem of education, right? So do you think it's trust and education, or just more so trust?
It's a mixture. It's a variety of different things. I'm using trust as a broad term. And it's not just education. People can be very educated and still not trust the system. Right? Many people who have been marginalized for a very long time would still be very distrustful of an outsider, a colonial outsider. It doesn't matter if they're educated or not.
Mhm.
And I'm not somebody who's arguing that I want to sort of somehow um, uh, I have the capacity to undo the damage of colonialism. Absolutely not. I can't. Nobody can do that. But I recognize the issues of trust and hoping to repair that through an understanding of what the barriers are. I think time will repair, policies will repair, people's behavior will repair. We see that in South Dakota, that Native American communities are very distrustful, and they have very good reason to be in that position. The world hasn't treated them well for a very long period of time.
Yeah. So I know we have 10 minutes left for Q&A, but one of the things that someone reached out to me, wanted to ask you is, what advice would you give someone wanting to pursue a career in your field? Yeah.
I think I would tell people to read broadly, as broadly as possible. And that means reading fiction and nonfiction, newspapers and policy papers, so whatever time allows, but do read books. I prefer that over sort of the modern world of social media, where things are less driven by thought and more driven by impulse. And I think that's a problem. I would tell them to, if they can, find good mentors. That is, to me, I was very fortunate, very blessed, alhamdulillah, to have that. They should try to find good mentors who believe in their success and create a healthy, enabling environment. And I think the third thing is that I think you have to first dig deep before you go broad. So at my stage of career, I have the good fortune and perhaps the luxury of being at a tenured professor who has the privilege of taking chances. But when you're starting off, I would say develop an expertise, focus on a few things, not too many. Sort of let people know your work for what it is, and stand on that in a community, whatever that community is. It could be computer scientists and mathematicians, it could be public health. And then sort of, as you go keep some kind of a diary of good ideas and continue to pursue those. I think whether you choose to become a doctor or an engineer, whether you choose to become an economist or a philosopher, there is space, lots of space rather, for you to contribute on important issues. And if you can, and I know again this is a privilege, so I say it with deep recognition of the good fortune that I've had. Do travel, meet people. If you go to a new place, try to roam and see how people live. Off the beaten tourist track. I caution people that it shouldn't be some kind of going to a refugee camp shouldn't be like going to a zoo. People are not there for your sort of pleasure and your sort of just to be taken photographs with. But if you do get an opportunity to spend a time in the city, see how people live, see how they manage, try to see the challenges that they see on a day-to-day basis. I try to read local authors every time I'm traveling. Of course, I don't speak most languages, so those will be translated in English or Urdu or something, but read local authors. So that's important, right? Let the locals tell you their story. And it could be anything. It could be a crime fiction, or it could be a family saga, or it could be a nonfiction book. But let the locals speak tell their story.
Yeah, definitely. So as a Pakistani native, have you tried to connect with your roots and kind of share those stories?
Yeah, very much so. So I just had a book come out in Urdu as well about a month ago about some of my travels, not in Pakistan, but written for a Pakistani audience. I do work quite a bit in Pakistan. I work both with the government, even though I may strongly disagree with them on one thing or the other. I travel to Pakistan every year. I try to speak Urdu at home. So I think it's part of our heritage. And whether or not I live there is I think there are a number of different reasons for that, and I'm happy to talk to anybody about it. There's nothing private about it. But it's home in many ways. I have a relationship with Urdu. I have a relationship with Pakistani music. I have a relationship with Pakistani food, with Pakistani cuisine, with Pakistani culture and sports. So I think that's part of who I am, and it'll always be like that.
Mhm. Could you expand upon your work with the government as an advisor?
Yeah, so it's not much of a honestly work, Talha. So when the new government came in power, and I just want to say that I've never voted for them. I was not in Pakistan when they came to power, and I like some of the things that they do. I disagree with many things that they do. Many. By no means I'm a supporter. I don't think they read what I write, because they would have kicked me out of the advisory role a long time ago if they read what I write rather. So the prime minister created what they call a task force to advise the government on national health reform. It's a lofty idea. And I can tell you that if it was governed by the other party and they'd asked me, I would have done the same thing. I said, yes, I'll help. Again, I get no money from them. If I do travel, I travel on my dime. So it is purely on that basis. They were interested in a number of things. It's a task for about 12 people. And the idea is certainly lofty and something that I care deeply about, of reforming the health sector in Pakistan. So access to health services, improving some of the laws. They were interested in two things that I was doing. One, I've been interested for a long time on access to quality medicines. So improving the quality of medicines, improving access to quality medicines. And the second question they're interested in is antibiotic resistance. I have nothing to show for this, neither of those. Those things are dead in the water. The government goes from one crisis to the other. So the problem with this, and this has been a remarkably learning experience, and it's not a criticism of this government. I have many things that I disagree with. This is not one of them. The way things work in Pakistan, and it's true perhaps in many other countries as well, that the policy planning part is actually quite weak. It's policy on a day-to-day basis. What is the crisis today? What do you do today? What's the newest problem that people are facing or the government is facing? What that means is that somebody like me is actually not very helpful, because I talk about things that are going to change over time. And there is very little bandwidth among the government to do that, because the way the entire system works is actually impulsive. What's the problem today? What's the problem tomorrow? What are people going to say? What is media going to say? What is the opposition going to say? All of those kinds of things. So that whole process, and that's true whether it's this government or the other, it remains the same. And then COVID came, and then there were other questions as well. So I am part of those committees once a month or once every 2 months. It's really typically spinning wheels and not much going on. And that unfortunately is true in many parts of the world. Health is not a priority, no matter what somebody says. And that is absolutely disheartening. But that's true. There are other priorities in Pakistan's case that would be defense, that would be perhaps economy, but health is not on that list.
Yeah.
And so my work, I can safely tell you, I have nothing to show that I did that. I worked on the law, to change the law for, and I wrote part of that with some legal colleagues, to change the law and improving the quality of medicines and creating a stricter law. That thing has been in the parliament for 2.5 years now.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I know Pakistan has a problem with a lot of fake medicines. I mean, I have a lot of health professionals in my own family, so I definitely know about that. Yeah, I think we should switch to Q&A now. I know Noura has a few questions from YouTube comment section, so we can go to that. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Hi, Assalamu alaikum. Okay, so yeah, let's start taking questions from YouTube. First of all, Faraz says, sometimes I'm concerned when donating to refugees because I hear that the local government sometimes intercept the money or it goes to some other reason some other people take it. Do you have any reliable resources or sources that someone can donate money to?
No, that's a very good question, and I think there's good reason for people to be concerned. My sense is, again, do your homework. Try to find where the money goes. I am in favor of support local institutions and local groups as well, not just large international agencies. But in the class that I teach, and I think both Waleed and Rana took it last year, there's whole notion of this click to donate kind of the world, and there's a danger in that. You feel good about yourself. You certainly perhaps are doing it with good intention, but that doesn't change things. So while I strongly encourage people to donate, I think that's a good thing. But I think doing a little bit more than sort of just, I would say, than just finding something on the flyer and donating it is what I would recommend. But people have to make their own decisions on that. I can't advise.
Yeah, definitely. That's very important. Another question from YouTube also says, to what extent do you feel that the refugee crisis has to do with the lack of resources as compared to a more systematic problem that perpetually marginalizes the people it's supposed to serve instead?
That's a really good question. I don't think there's one reason. I think a lot of it has to do with politics. I think a lot of it has to do with sort of regional and local politics. For example, the crisis in Yemen is an example of that. I think there are other issues associated as well. In Yemen, the challenge was geopolitics of the region combined with sort of climate change, water stress, other things. In Syria, it was a different set of factors. The stateless, the Bengalis in Pakistan have different reasons to be sort of have different reasons for them to be marginalized. So I think there is an element of systematic issues, but it's not always resources as well. Venezuela, for example, is fairly well endowed when it comes to oil. It's a country facing tremendous challenges in South America. So I think there is an element of resources, but there's also a contextual aspect that I think is important to understand broadly as well.
Yeah, definitely. Someone also asked, when it comes to traveling, how do you connect with the locals right away? Is it through connections, organizations, etc.? Especially since you may be a foreigner in the land, how do you make that connection quickly with them?
That's a great point. So in my case, so different people would do it differently. I tend to work with academic institutions, so I strongly believe in the role of higher education in society. So I work very, very closely with academic institutions. So all of our partners in all of the countries that we work in are connected to institutions of higher learning. So some people would do it through NGOs, some people do it through perhaps local organizations, local communities. My approach, as I mentioned earlier to Talha, is slightly more research oriented, and I want to be a part of the development of those questions and understanding and debate and discussion and implementation. So I tend to do it through academic partners. So in Lebanon, it's through American University of Beirut. In Yemen, we have partners both in UNICEF, also at the university. We have similar partners in Colombia and in Uganda as well. I have found that to be really rich on two dimensions. One is, of course, I think I can relate better to other academics, other professors who are there, and I learn a lot from them. But I also get an opportunity, just as I have here, this tremendous privilege of being with students and learning and thinking and discussing it from their eyes is, I think, very, very, I mean, it's tremendously enjoyable and gratifying, but I think it's also very, very exciting in my view, and it allows me to sort of certainly learn and reflect and think about the impact it may make in future years as these students go through their careers.
That's a really good point. Yeah. Someone asked on Zoom, you mentioned that your work was more analytical rather than laborious. However, these problems with refugees are very intricate. So how have you been able to propose policies on such a grand level, and how have they been played out?
So in some of our work, the policy, so you have different channels. So in some ways, you don't propose policies directly, but rather you provide policymakers with new tools to look at the problem. So I'll give here another example of Rana's work in nutrition. And we're thinking about the questions of the issue of malnutrition, or rather acute malnutrition in Yemen, and the various factors. So by designing and thinking about this in new ways, you give the tool set to UNICEF or the local government in planning for those challenges, right? So my job, and who am I to tell anybody that this is how you should do? I mean, I think one has to be very humble about it. But what you can do is you can offer new approaches to look at the problem that gives a new set of tools to the people who are involved in policy to do that. Ultimately, and I strongly believe in this, policy has to be organic. It should not be a colonial system, somebody sitting in Boston telling somebody in Yemen or in Somalia how to live their lives, not at all. But with sort of organic partnerships, you're able to do that. So we have been very interested in that question. So that's one example, right? Similarly, we have worked with colleagues in Uganda in terms of improving access to antibiotics and trying to institute a quality metric in drug quality. So ultimately, the government of Uganda, the people who are sort of working with refugees directly, they have to sort of own and perhaps even adapt the solution. And that's how we have thought about it. Are there examples of things changing on the ground? I would say small. But what is changing, which I think is more important, is that by working with students, particularly in these communities, we have over the last 5 or 7 years started to place students who would go into these policy domains. And by having that knowledge, they're able to think slightly differently. And this is particularly true in Lebanon. Some of the people who have graduated from the program that we've involved in have now gone in places where policy is decided or discussed or debated. And that's important. I think that allows for that. And then when you're in academia, you have to sort of recognize that you are in this for the long haul. So you work on policy documents, you work on papers, and somebody might read that 10 years later, and that's okay. And I think you have to recognize that your contribution is to create new knowledge. How that knowledge gets used and acquired is, I think, entirely up to the local groups.
Yeah, it's definitely a very complex process, but these are all very great points for sure. So we have another question, a little bit more about your identity and the factors that have eased the transition from living in your hometown to living abroad in a non-Muslim country. And do you have any advice for international students who don't have family members in the US and who are going through that same transition?
Yeah, initially it was very hard. I think it is hard for people who even move from one town to the other. That sort of being in a new community is difficult. I don't think I would say that I had some kind of a major culture shock, but I think the feeling of loneliness is certainly there, especially if you've never lived out of your home alone ever. And that was my case. I had never I've always lived in my home. I had never sort of lived alone anywhere. So it was hard. It was great distance, and this is the time well before you guys were born, where you didn't have the electronic communication the way you do now, and that sense of isolation was very real. So, what can I advise? I think having a good group of friends is wonderful. I think being part of community like the Islamic Society or various cultural societies is important. I think we all know that it's very tough. So I think I would encourage people to be part of these kinds of communities that offer an opportunity to engage and work and just develop sort of these lifelong friendships. I don't think I have any great advice of. I think everybody's experience is different, and the circumstances of life in Boston may be very different than in Austin, Texas, or in California or Arizona. But I would say that that do try to sort of be part of that if you can. If you're international, being part of a community that has had other people who have had that experience. I personally benefited tremendously by getting to know people who were international students before me, and had settled in the towns and were part of that cultural experience. That was, I think, wonderful.
Yeah, definitely. I would also say that having a very supportive community with who shares similar beliefs and values, like ISPU here, has definitely helped me personally a lot as well. We also have a second question relating to BME this time. Do you think that pursuing BME as an undergraduate degree is a good stepping stone for students interested more into about biological research?
Yeah, I think BME is broad enough now that it gives you the opportunity to learn different things. I think if you are a student at BU in BME, there are many research opportunities that allows you to sort of move your interest, whether it is towards pharma or towards industry or medicine or sort of data analytics. So I think the degree at BME, the degree at BU and BME, and I'm saying that as I was a postdoc at MIT, I taught at UT Austin. I'm saying this with the experience that it's actually very good, and I think the opportunities that are there are quite extraordinary. What I would tell this colleague who asked that question is that they should try to get involved in research and in their electives try to be creative in the sense that they should not take a course that they just think that they have taken because somebody else recommended it, but sort of something different. I think there are people who have gone into pharma. I know Sarim is here, who was now in medical school. So I think, and Wali as well. So I think that's yeah, the opportunities are quite very alive and very real.
We have a slightly more personal question as well. So you mentioned that you were very into reading different books by local authors or newspapers or whatnot, different media. What would you say is your favorite book that you would recommend to students here?
I think many, and I am certainly not someone who can. I mean, I read try to read frequently and broadly. I think I would encourage people to read outside of their academic interests as much as they can. I tell people to read broadly, certainly read fiction, certainly. A number of books that I've liked. There are many books. I do like Colombian authors. I do like Gabriel Garcia Marquez and 100 Years of Solitude. I think that's really a fantastic book. I like another book which I would recommend. It's called Cutting for Stone. Another great fiction book in case somebody's interested in medicine and health, and it's a family saga. It's really a brilliant book. There's another book that I liked tremendously. It's called People of the Book. All of these are fiction books that I mentioned. Other than that, in nonfiction, depending on your interests I try to read broadly, certainly history. There's a very good fiction book, by the way, called I Saw Ramallah. It's a thin book. It's really good by a Palestinian author. These are all fiction books. In nonfiction, again, depends really on interest. I tend to read a little bit more history or biographies than let's say, current affairs. And in that regard, there are books about, there's a very famous, he was a Harvard professor, died I think 10 years ago, 15 years ago. His name is John Galbraith, Galbraith, and he had written books on the 1950s about economy and sort of the gaps between rich and poor, and unfortunately that turned out to be absolutely true. I think it's hard for me to point one, but I'm happy to talk to people individually if they have interests, and I'd be glad to sort of speak.
Yeah, we'll definitely make sure to check all of these out. These seem like amazing recommendations for sure. So someone was wondering who were the top 3 most influential people in your life that have really shaped your career, your perspective on life, everything like that.
I think there are several. I would say it's hard to really name just 3. At different stages of my life, different people are very important. I mentioned that my father died when I was relatively young. My mother played a role in giving me a sense of self-confidence and a sense of integrity. I think she had a very, very high sense of integrity. I mentioned my brother, who is among the smartest people I know, and just a very thorough scholar. So I learned a lot from his scholarship. I have, even though he's not in my discipline at all, but I still talk to him and learn and come out every time. So certainly with the tremendous degree of inspiration. I learned a lot from my aunt, my mother's sister. She became blind early on, so she was in medical school when there's a genetic disorder called retinitis pigmentosa, and she was blind, and she finished medical school. She practiced all her life despite being blind, and sort of had these sort of charities that she ran in Pakistan. She, as a woman, as a blind woman, she was just absolutely inspirational. And I didn't think much of it at that time, but now I look back and I recognize sort of her inspiration all over my life. She would travel all over the world championing the rights of especially poor blind women, right? So it's a triple burden. You're a woman in Pakistan, you are poor, and you are blind. So that is just you can imagine the burden of that and how she sort of championed that. Many of my academic mentors were great. My PhD advisor was a very, very famous physical chemist. He was Undersecretary of Energy in Carter's time, and then came back to academia. There's something called an environment called life cycle analysis that everybody does. He came up with that. But he was the one who sort of pushed me, knowing my interests, that I should take public policy classes. At a time when PhD professors wouldn't let you sort of step out of the lab, he pushed me to take public policy classes. He was the one who, despite the fact that was not trained in history, would give me papers. And incredibly accomplished man, incredibly busy man, would give me papers about sort of the early Muslim history of how people viewed thermodynamics in 9th and 10th century. And he didn't have to do that. I mean, he just sort of genuinely believed in that. And despite somebody who was from Colorado, a white Jewish man, he decided to help set up Pakistan's first science and engineering university. So that kind of an inspiration guy. So those are the people. I think all throughout my life, I've been very fortunate by being in the company of people who are just remarkably inspiring. And I think there are people among my students who help me think in ways that are just unique and that are driven by a deeper sense of empathy. So I think it would be very hard for me to name top 3, because at different points in my life, there are different people who've sort of been instrumental in shaping who I am.
Right, that's very true. These all sound like amazing people, definitely, and they're very inspirational, all of their stories. We do have one more question. Someone was wondering what high school in the Bronx that you went to?
I didn't go to Bronx. This is the Thomas Jefferson High School in Bronx that I work with.
Okay, got it. Does anybody else have any last minute questions?
Hi, I have a question. Right. Let me just say it's very inspirational hearing about the work that you've done. And the question that I have for you is how has the work that you've done overseas influenced or shaped your personality?
That's a great question, Monis. One, it has given me a deeper sense of our shared humanity. It has also told me what I think are important problems that I want to focus on all over the world. It has also told me that the problems are not just in Beirut, they're also in Flint, Michigan, driven by the same kind of challenges of collapse of the public system, of corruption, of marginalized communities. So it has given me a deeper sense of that. And it has given me, perhaps the most important thing is just opening my eyes and ears to cultures and traditions and sort of bringing me down from any pedestal of superiority that I may have had of any one society over the other. And I mean anyone. So that means Pakistan over US, US over Sudan, Sudan over Indonesia. So I think that has been a wonderful lesson in that regard. And that people all over the world have their unique set of challenges, and they're driven often by similar kinds of issues. And there's a need for collective approaches to that.
Right. It's interesting. And I was also wondering, what was your first experience like working overseas?
So there are two parts of that thing. So when you are in research or academia, you often go outside because of conferences. That is not necessarily work overseas, right? So my first conference abroad was in Vienna. I wasn't working there, but I got a chance to meet, for example, professors and students there, right? So that's one experience. This is in 2004. My first experience working abroad was in Zambia. This is 2010, about 12 years, 11 years ago. And this was my first time in Africa as well. And we were working on pneumonia diagnostics. And I remember very clearly this sense, this is a time when this kind of a second wave of HIV was in full swing in sub-Saharan Africa. And it was very troubling because the average age or average life expectancy in Zambia was about 25 years less than it was in the US. And it really bothered me. And I remember very clearly working with the Dean of Medicine. His name was Yaqub Mullah. Sort of, it was from the generation of people who came in 1800s and 1900s. Their ancestors, of course, from India and came to sub-Saharan Africa, right? So there was a whole group of people who moved. And he told me that, you know, the challenges are so acute that any major development that we do may not affect, will not only affect small community, it might very well change the life expectancy of a whole country if you can prevent people dying. And that was just so deeply moving to see that any work, and certainly not mine, but any work has the ability to really move that needle for millions of people. And it was a remarkable experience. I mean, I'd never been to sub-Saharan Africa. And it really sort of challenged many of my preconceived notions about Africa, about Africans, about society there. I'd read things, but I'd never been there. So being there was just absolutely fascinating.
It's honestly impressive. I mean, just moving to a different country in itself is a big deal, but having to work there and not be, you work in a risky environment and you stuck to it. What kept you going back for more? Like you went to other countries as well. It's very impressive to me, honestly. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if I can take any credit for that. I never sort of did it on my own alone. At that time, I was working closely with the BU. There was something called Center for Global Health and Development at the BU School of Public Health. It has since been absorbed in other departments. And I always had mentors who had done this for 2, 3 decades. So I don't know if I can take any credit. I was just sort of going and following a path that other people had already created. So that's just, I would say that it was never hard. I was certainly very interested, and I was certainly very eager to learn. But and some of those people are still faculty members at BU. Some of them have retired. Some of them have gone to other institutions. They were just absolutely remarkable and opened so many doors.
Yeah, so if no one else has any other questions, I'll wait a minute to see if any more questions pop up in the chat.
I just wanted to say that I appreciate your time, and I know your busy schedule. Extremely humble of you to say that, but obviously there are many people that made your path easier, but we appreciate, and I think everyone has learned so much through your work.
No, I think it's an honor. I'm happy to stay and come back. I think it's just been a wonderful hour and a half, and as I mentioned, I mean, there are many people here in this call who have had the true honor of being part of their research journey, and I mean it. It's been really a wonderful experience, and it's I think all of us. I mean, so this is something that some of the colleagues who have traveled with us, Sarim and Zahra and Rana know. This recognition that you have when you are abroad, of seeing a world that is very similar to yours and very different at the same time, and feeling both privileged to be in another country, another place, but also recognizing that they are no different. It's just remarkably powerful. It's both disempowering if you have certain views about yourself and the world, but it's also tremendously empowering. And I think that's just great.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to plug in your latest book about microbial resistance. I did put the link down there for Amazon, so if anyone wants to check out his book, you guys can definitely do that. If you guys do want more information from Dr. Zaman, you can definitely reach out to him as a professor. He also has many YouTube videos. I do remember going and seeing your global health, global refugee crisis lecture 2 years ago, which really amazed me. So thank you so much, Dr. Zaman.
Thank you so much for joining us today and for taking the time out of your busy schedule. I'm sure you have lots of work to do, and sharing a little bit about your experiences and your perspectives with us today. Thank you again.
If you guys can, definitely subscribe, like, and share on YouTube, Podcast Paradigm. Thank you so much. He disconnected?
Yeah,
Okay, yeah.
we should wait.
Okay. How did that happen?
Wait, Rana, where did you guys go on a trip to with like Dr. Zaman?
Lebanon last year.
Oh, Lebanon.
In winter break.
Wait, was that when I met you at the airport, Rana?
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's cool.
My internet had gone and it's back now. Sorry. This happens more often than when I would like to admit it.
No worries. I just wanted to end our podcast by saying that if you would like to come back, we'd definitely love to have you in the future. We will definitely check out all of our other stuff as we will continue to roll out more podcasts with other leaders and other impactful academic professors.
Well,
Thank you.
It's a pleasure, and keep doing the thing. I was just telling my wife and my kids how privileged I am that you thought of me, and really sort of honored. And this is a wonderful organization, and I'm happy to be part of this community.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zaman.
All right, thank you.